Daniel Goldfarb is the creator of Julia on HBO Max, and Chris Keyser is the showrunner of Julia on HBO Max. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. It's such a pleasure to speak with both of you today. I'm such a huge fan of the show. It's such a delight to watch. And Daniel, I wanted to start with you as creator and just ask right off the bat, what was the inspiration for the series? Was it a lifelong dream or an ambition you've had for a while to do a show about Julia, or was there kind of a spark of inspiration at some point where you said, this would make a terrific TV series?
So it's been a lifelong dream of mine to do something about food, but it wasn't a lifelong dream of mine to do something about Julia. In fact, it wasn't my idea. It was Kimberly Carver's idea. And thank goodness I got submitted for it, and I got to meet with her, and I got to tell her what my thoughts were. And I was sort of elated that I even got to be in the room with her. And thank goodness she decided to move forward with me. And then thank goodness Chris joined us. So, but really the first pilot I ever wrote was about a restaurant critic who reviewed restaurants in disguise. And my mother wrote cookbooks, and I love cooking and eating and going to restaurants. I've wanted to do something food related my whole career. And then of course, like Julia is the Mount Everest of food related, IP. So I got very lucky.
Yeah, no question. And the passion for food really comes through in every episode. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But Chris, I wanted to bring you in and ask, and Daniel, this could be a question for you also, but I wanted to ask, what was the decision and the discussions that you had either between the two of you and others on at what moment in Julia Child's life we should start the series? Because there's so many different, moments in time that a series could start. I could imagine, a whole series on her life in France, and maybe that's a prequel you could cook up in the future. But, this is such a kind of specific moment in time and a brilliant place to start the series. So, what was the idea behind that?
Well, a couple of things come together at this moment. It is obviously from her biography, it is the moment where she begins this cooking show, which is not the first thing she did that was public. She wrote mastering. So it's the moment where that begins. Most important for me and for Daniel, it is the beginning of the second chapter in both Julia's life and Paul's life and in the life of this marriage. And this story in large part, although it encompasses we hope, the entire course of making the French chef and a lot of different issues that get raised through the 60s and 70s. It is fundamentally, at its heart, the story about an evolving, wonderful modern marriage and the decision by two people who had been very remarkable in the first part of their lives to sometime between 50-ish and 60-ish start again. And so that worked perfectly for us. We started in 62. And the marriage switches. Paul Child, who had been the Foreign Service officer and taken them all over the world, and Julia Child, who had been his remarkable wife, who had eventually learned how to cook at his behest and gotten involved in French cooking and written mastering, a book that, as we begin the story, has begun to lose its general interest on the bookshelves. They're both faced with, what does this mean? We're in the twilight of our lives. Are we done, or is there something else? And what they discover about themselves and how they evolve their marriage is the story of the season and the series.
Yeah, that's great. Daniel, back to you. Obviously, when you do a series on Julia Child, you have to cast a Julia Child. And I know you both talked about wanting Sarah Lancashire from the very beginning. So my question is more, not so much, well, what was the process of finding her, but how did you both know that she would just be so pitch perfect in the role? Because it really is a transformative and transcendent performance.
I mean, we're both just huge fans of her work and just think she is one of the greatest actors alive, there's so many qualities that she has. She has these incredible, expressive, enormous eyes, and you could kind of see her think, and she can, somehow she can convey multiple conflicting emotions simultaneously. And we knew she was a great dramatic actress, but we also, when we looked her up and read about her and knew what some of her West End credits were, that she had done comedy, that she had done theater, it felt like She would have the gravity of Julia. She would have the weight and the presence and the authority of Julia. But there's this other side of her, this delightful, charming, theatrical, stage person that she could also bring to the table. And we were just, it was a hunch, and it was a hunch that other people had with us. So we had our incredible casting director, Sharon Bialy and Gohar Gazazian, and we had Lionsgate and 3 Arts and HBO Max. Everyone sort of, her name was the one that kind of just like leapt off the list. And
Linda Lowy.
Yeah, and Linda Lowy, of course. Yeah. So, and I mean, and of course she delivered and then some, I think. So.
Yeah, Chris, a similar question for you on casting Paul, because David Hyde Pierce is, again, seems like such a kind of perfect fit for the character. And what I love about his performance, and this is true of Sarah's as well, is he's obviously so supportive of Julia and is an adoring husband, but we also really get to look into, some of the challenges that he has as their life kind of transitions, as you were saying earlier, especially as Julia's celebrity starts to rise. So I just wanted to ask you about, working with David Hyde Pierce and finding that nuance in the performance, because it is funny, but it's also very, heartwarming and moving in how he's kind of grappling with some of the challenges of the new phase of their relationship.
Yeah, I'm glad that came across. By the way, the part was written for David. He was always what we had in mind, the person we had in mind. He wasn't available when we originally were going to shoot the pilot in March of 2020 because he had a theatrical obligation. And then we cast somebody else, also a wonderful actor, who then had to leave once we shut down. And we took a 6-month, we didn't know how long it was going to be, but it turned out to be about a 6-month hiatus. And at that point, we got lucky enough that David was once again available. And so we got our first, in some sense, our first and only choice for the part. And a little bit like Sarah also, David just has a history of, he's obviously well known as a comic actor, but he's actually a deeply moving dramatic actor as well. And we knew that about him, as we did, by the way, about Bebe Neuwirth. And we knew full well that the central idea of this series was going to be about the negotiation, sort of, between Julia and Paul in moving forward in life and rejiggering the power dynamics, but not the love relationship in their marriage. And we just had a hunch again that David, with all his subtlety, was going to be able to do that. You'd have to talk to him about what gave him that intuition. I hope some of it was on the page, obviously, so we pointed in that direction. We were very careful all the way through to say, okay, this is 1962 and we can't forget it. What would a man in 1962 who was faced with the possibility that suddenly, having been both the breadwinner and the really remarkable one, who brought his wife along, who taught her how to cook, who took her around the world, who found a partner in her, what would he do when her star began to rise and his began to fall? And he just so precisely charted that journey. And it's not a solo journey, obviously. It's both Julia and Paul together. They continue to love each other. She brings him along. She can't do it without him. It's not as if he's overshadowed. He's just the second, he's the one who doesn't get the spotlight. And they manage this thing. I mean, they hadn't met each other before, Sarah and David, but that chemistry that you see is the magic that you have to hope for in a production, and you can't guess at before. It's a little bit what Daniel said. It's like we knew all these things about them, and then we just had to cross our fingers and say go.
Yeah, you also mentioned, Chris, Bebe Neuwirth as Avis, Julia's confidant, who helps her kind of take this show off the ground. And I wanted to ask you both, and we'll start with you, Chris, about filling out the cast with all of these secondary characters who most are real figures from Julia's life, but a lot of viewers probably don't know as well. Certainly they know Julia and maybe they know Paul, but not necessarily, the cookbook editor and her friends and the other people at the station. So, how did you pick which characters to fill out the series with? Because the ensemble, just comes together so beautifully.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are obvious. They are the closest people in Julia's life, particularly as she begins to make the show. So Avis, who's her closest friend, and Russ Marash, who's the director, producer of the show, and Judith Jones, who was the editor of mastering. But one of the things that Daniel and I talked about a lot was that Julia is this extraordinary person who gets all of this attention, surrounded by equivalently extraordinary people. So Avis Devoto is the wife of a Harvard professor. Late in life, she goes back to work at Harvard. Her letters are remarkable. Her participation in the show is remarkable. She deserves a lot of credit for it. Russ Marash is the father of DIY television. I mean, a huge percentage of what is on television today begins with the intuition of Russ Marash, not just with The French Chef, but also Victory Garden and This Old House and all of those things. That all comes from Russ. By the way, his wife Marion becomes a James Beard award-winning chef. Judith Jones, maybe the most remarkable of them all. As a young woman, she translates Sartre and Camus. She discovers Anne Frank. She goes on to be the editor of John Updike and Ann Tyler and many other people. She writes cookbooks. She edits cookbooks, not just for Julia, but for a whole bunch of remarkable people who changed the way America eats. She worked for a woman, Blanche Knopf, who may be one of the most important people in the history of editing, who gets too little credit because her husband, Alfred Knopf, gets too much of it. But it was a tight circle of brilliant people surrounding this most shining star, but they deserve their own stories as well. Did I forget anything, Daniel?
No, I think you got everything.
Yeah, Daniel, I want to ask you next, one of the episodes that you've written in the early part of the season, the second episode, takes us through kind of step by step the process of translating a recipe that Julia wants to feature on the test episode and figuring out how to capture that in a television segment, an episode of The French Chef. It's such an illuminating and wonderful sequence, but I have to imagine with such an education for the two of you and for the cast and crew on how to do that, but also how to capture what a production of a show would be like at that time, the cameras and the set. So just take us through that process of how much you maybe knew because of your background, but also how much of that was discovery and wanting to capture that in the series.
I mean, it was a little bit of everything. We did a lot of research and we read, Julia actually made 3 pilot episodes, not 1, and none of them exist. And she's very happy that none of them exist. And she talks a lot about how kind of disastrous they were. So we knew that going in from the research. And then we just had to think about what it was like at that time when no one had really done this before and how to go through it beat by beat. And we took as inspiration the Michael Frayn play Noises Off. So the first half of the episode is really them rehearsing and then figuring it out. And we kind of see the way they navigate things are supposed to go. And then we see what happens when it's live. And something that Charles, the director, did so beautifully is those shots of the camera and those shots of the clock. They add like an anxiety to it all. I think he gave it the sequence like a scale beyond the theatricality of it. And then thank goodness it all added together. Jeff Danner wrote that like incredible tango score for it, and just sort of the whole thing came to life.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, the passion that you both have for food and kind of capturing all of these parts of the process really comes through so vividly.
I mean, actually, the draft, we had so many more details that didn't make it into the final episode, like fluting mushrooms and flipping onions, and we shot a lot of it too. There was one sequence that where Sarah dropped a head of garlic and Avis is under the table and she throws it and Sarah catches it, but ultimately we couldn't use all of it, and it had to look bad, but it couldn't have looked so bad that they seem insane to even air it. So, but we sort of threw everything at it. We tried to come up with any kind of thing that could go wrong and any kind of thing that they had to invent. Some like tricking out the pots and pans and having stuff, prepped. All of that was just sort of us trying to imagine we were inventing food television.
Yeah, this is a similar question, Chris. What I love about the structure of the season, and we'll see, if that continues, but every episode seems to be focused on either an episode of The French Chef or is named after, a recipe that she's working on. I just wanted to ask, the idea for that, and also how you are trying to tie recipes and episodes into some of the themes of the show or of that individual episode, because I think it always comes together so nicely. And I love the kind of focus on, whether it's a new episode or a recipe, or in the latest episode that aired since we're talking, the baking of the bread, trying to test out the perfect recipe for the at-home chef. So just talk a bit about, finding those recipes and episodes to structure the season.
Yeah, the idea of naming the episodes for the recipes came relatively early. I think we approached it from a couple of different points of view. The first thing was we wanted to show all different parts of the process, right? We didn't want to repeat ourselves. So some of the episodes you watch the rehearsal for the show, and some of the episodes you watch the making of the show, and one of the episodes you watch the editing of the show, and the episode you're talking about you watch the preparation for a cookbook chapter that's not part of the show at the same time as she's making sweetbreads, which is so the most wondrous thing at all that people find mouthwatering breads is combined with this thing that I think makes a lot of people want to gag. So we just knew we wanted to do that, and we parceled them out over the course of the episodes. We tied them to where she was going to be. So for example, when she was going to go, you'll see in the next episode, she travels to New York. And that recipe has everything to do with the restaurant they go to there. So it's always varies, and it's about the different kinds of food experiences that they have. We tried, I think, pretty hard to design the season. It's actually designed around 3 chapters. It's designed around chapter 1 through 3, which Daniel talked a little bit about, which takes you from the moment she thinks about cooking on television to the very first moment they begin to film the French chef. Then the next, and that the way those recipes work, the coq au vin and beef bourguignon, the discovery of how to do that, were deeply entwined with the history of the French chef. They're some of her most famous recipes. And the second chapter is about the growth of the French chef in culture, and how, most importantly, how Julia and Paul navigated the fact that she became a public personality. And you will see the last chapter is about the meaning of the show, and what they take the show to mean, and what it means in America, and whether it's a good or bad thing. We won't give too much away. And those dishes reflect that part of her life. So it was very consciously designed as a kind of 3-act play. And there's something obviously a lot of people in the show come out of the theater. Daniel is a playwright, and I love the theater, but I'm not a playwright. But the theatricality of it mirrors Julia's theatricality.
Yeah, no question. And I also love your mentioning, the next episode she goes to New York. I love the episodes where Julia kind of leaves the kitchen and the house and goes to different places. And we see, how she kind of is reacting to not just her newfound, kind of celebrity status, but also how she deals with situations that are maybe uncomfortable, because she always handles it with such grace. I also wanted to ask you both about the other power dynamics you're exploring in the show. We're not just looking at, public television and Julia, but also the world of publishing, and also through the character of Alice, looking at the power dynamics of public television. So I just wanted to ask you thematically about, the focus on these different aspects of culture, whether it's Paul and painting, or, publishing and TV. What is so interesting to both of you about, kind of exploring culture at this moment in American history?
I mean, to sort of go off what Chris was saying when he was talking about how extraordinary all the people Julia sort of collected, her little community were these extraordinarily literate, articulate, slightly theatrical, witty, charming people. They were great company. When you read about them, they felt like great company. And Chris and I always talked about, we just wanted the show more than anything else to be great company. And Chris and I are both people that love culture and love the arts and love literature and arts and letters. And so it felt like it was very exciting that Julia was this way into this world. And then the more research we did, as Chris was saying, like, you could do a fantastic show about Judith Jones and Knopf and her relationship with Blanche and publishing in the 60s and being the foremost, female editor in the country then, and probably still to this day. I mean, so it was exciting. Paul was just extraordinary, that he was like a carpenter, and he was a photographer, and he was a painter, and his photographs hang in the Museum of Modern Art. Like, he was an extraordinary artist. So the fact that we got to explore people that were just truly literary people that felt the arts made their lives and the world a richer, better place was really an honor and a privilege.
But is it, if I can jump on that, by the way, what I think what we did then is to say, well, what is it like to be a man of 60 doing that? What is it like to be a young person of color doing it? What's it like to be the only woman in a publishing house doing it? What's it like to be 6'2" and look and sound like Julia Child and try to be a television celebrity? So it's, when you say, I mean, the art and culture is part of a changing. Daniel talked really early about the idea that we were going to start in Camelot and end in Watergate if we could, because that was the course of the French chef. So how did America change, and how did it change for these people who were not obviously, they weren't the center of things. They weren't mostly like young white men, right? So how did they make our culture as a kind of group of outsiders? Is that fair, Daniel?
Yeah, absolutely.
Daniel Goldfarb and Chris Keyser, thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today, and congratulations on Julia.
Thank you so much.
We really appreciate it.